So look, the Beach Brothers Show is a show where we deal with Virginia business and politics.
Well, I'm Conrad. I'm a Hampton Roads political activist. Best ideas for community improvement happen to drive me.
I help folks that are approaching retirement and in their retirement years.
I have what I call the empowerment agenda. And that means that everything I do is focused on empowerment. You want to give a salute to Tally and Twine. It's time for you to have a high quality watch made in Virginia, made in Portsmouth, Virginia, from Tally and Twine. We want to say thanks to Southern Volkswagen Greenbrier for their great level of sponsorship. If you need a new car, you don't need to go far. Southern Volkswagen Greenbrier. And ladies, if you want your brows to say, wow, check out IamLitaWee.com. Microblading by IamLitaWee.com. I'm Seko Varner. I do credit fixes, tax resolutions. I lend private money to real estate investors, and we do debt consolidations. If you need any of these services, contact me as provided. And now it's time to get beachy on the Beach Brothers Show. All right, time to get beachy. How's everybody doing today?
Doing good.
Well, good to see you, Jose. Good to see you, Seko.
Always good to see my brothers.
Ashe. All right, well, let's get things started. Hey, it's time for my podium, and I want to say something that's I think is important that everyone really start paying attention to. One of the things that I was doing with one of my classes is having them follow the voting record of the school board members that represented them. And I found it a little challenging to find the voting record. And so I said, all right, well, let me look at city council. Maybe we can easily get that information. And I found it very challenging. You know, you got to read through all the minutes. You have to watch the entire video. And it makes it a bit challenging for you just to look and say, let me see if this seated politician lines up with my interests and my agenda. And I'm not saying it's a conspiracy. I'm just saying it needs to be easier. So there are things that need to happen. And one of those things is making it easier for us to track the voting record of our seated politicians, the people that we entrusted, we gave a vote of confidence to. So what I implore you to do, and I'll be doing with the Hampton Roads Black Caucus, is encouraging, noting, pushing, and impressing upon our seated politicians that there needs to be a process to make that process easier. So I can look up and say, let me see what Nick Freitas voted on. You know, let me see what John Bell voted on. Let me see what Mike Dumas voted on. You know, let me see what Kenny Wright voted on, and get all of those votes in a consolidated, easy manner, not where you have to search around for it. So if you have the same concern, I implore you to talk to those people in power and say, we need to find a way to make it easier. Hey, look, it's more of us than there are of them, and they work for us. So get them to work easier for us. I'm Seko Varner, Mr. Empowerment. So, hey, salute to my beloved country. Peace out to Brooklyn. 2 up and 2 down for VA. We love you. Conrad, what's on you, brother? What's your podium?
My podium is that I definitely would like to help you on the idea of influencing the Hampton Roads Black Caucus, especially on the idea of transparency. I do like that issue. I was just thinking of an idea that maybe it could be a reformation that we bring to each respective city's council that, hey, each meeting's ending point, they do a full field rundown, if we were using like a sports term. Say, hey, each of these members voted in this fashion, and then they put it on Facebook. They just list it. It doesn't have to go far. You could just like Virginia Beach City Government on Facebook, bam, and they list every Tuesday night or Wednesday morning how everyone voted. I think that could be a good idea to help influence that. It makes it a lot easier, so we don't have to go researching all the time. I'm also a great member in Virginia Beach of trying to influence the Virginia Beach Democratic Party's success, as well as progressive ideals. I like to represent that here on the Beach Brothers show. That's why I like to book some of the great guests so we could, just chop it up and talk about the great ideas of the day. Tonight is sort of different than what it was last Thursday night when we had, as we see Mr. Tavoris make a comment. He was a great co-host for three progressives that we had on who are running for the General Assembly. And today we're going to have more of a Republican-based show. That's why I would also like to reintroduce coming on tonight as a co-host for the Beach Brothers, sort of a beach sister, if you will, because this is another returning trip, a local Republican activist, a local consultant, a mom of two, Lucia Owens on the show once again. So what's up, Lucia? Are you ready to roll tonight?
Definitely ready. Thank you for having me on.
Love it. Love it. We're also going to roll with a great guest, a prominent Virginia politician wanting another crack at the Beach Brothers show. As the last time the feeds didn't work out too well and we weren't able to keep them on for the entire allotted time. So we wanted to bring it back so we could finish up. And this is sort of like a take two kind of moment. And taking two tonight is the 41-year-old delegate hailing from Culpeper, Virginia, aka the 30th House District seat, Nick Freitas. He's an independent consultant. He's a former Green Beret. He's a former Virginia candidate for the United States Senate and the United States House. And he runs the podcast, Making the Argument, a strong way to bring his stances on conservative values to the fold. And as they always say, if you're in the battle place of the marketplace of ideas, make sure that you have a great storefront. And Nick has a great storefront with Making the Argument. So thank you for coming on again, Delegate. You doing well tonight?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on.
I love it. I love having everyone on tonight. It's also great to have the entire Beach for the show and some great Republican flavor on this night. And I want to start off looking back toward the General Assembly session that just came and went. You were on the front lines as the minority party. Tell us some of the highlights and some of the lowlights that you saw from the General Assembly this past year.
Well, as far as highlights, obviously being in the minority party, we don't get a whole lot passed that we would like to see. I think that one of the highlights I was excited about was some of the work that we did on expanding access and making it easier for nurse practitioners to be able to operate in Virginia. I think this is a good idea all the time, but especially with COVID and people struggling to be able to have access to skilled medical professionals, to be able to remove some of the regulatory burdens that we had on nurse practitioners, I think was really important. We were able to do some more stuff too with midwives as well. So I think on the medical front, I congratulate, I think it was Delegate Don Adams who carried that legislation. It was good legislation. I certainly supported it. I think there was also some missed opportunities on kind of the lowlights thing, the marijuana legalization. I'm one of the Republicans, along with some of the others, that are very open to it. The problem I had with it is you looked at the regulatory apparatus that they were putting in with it, and it just, they're taxing it to death. They're heavily restricting licenses, and I think that one of the main reasons why you would legalize something like marijuana is to take it off the black market. Well, if you have a regulatory environment that's really difficult to navigate or very restrictive, if you have a taxing environment which drastically increases the price, you don't really get rid of the black market. And so I think that was problematic. And again, I would have liked to have seen more of a straight up bill. Actually, Delegate Steve Heretic, I think, had a better bill. And then if they wanted to do a lot of these things with respect to regulatory policy, taxing and things like that, they could have made that separate in accompanying legislation. I think you would have actually gotten more broad-based support for it. So that's just two examples.
Cut off.
Oh, am I back on, or did I get cut off?
Also, how much of the stuff you champions got through, and what important things did you not get through?
Well, again, this is probably going to come as a huge shock, but I'm not exactly a favorite of some of my Democrat colleagues, and so most of my bills, they did receive a hearing, but they didn't really go anywhere. The ones I was probably especially frustrated about. Some of the ones I had one bill on Second Amendment. which allowed for constitutional carry because, again, if you got a woman that wants to carry a firearm, but she doesn't want to carry it open, I don't think she should have to go through a bunch of bureaucratic loopholes in order to carry it concealed. And so that would have, yeah, and that would open it up. But I expected, I didn't expect that to get very far, but I still think it's important to fight for it. Two of the ones that I had, I don't know if I want to say high hopes for, but I would have thought would have been, we could have got some bipartisan support for, I'll put it that way. One had to do with education. And, obviously with COVID, we've had a lot of schools that have shut down, which has stopped in-person learning for most students across Virginia, either entirely or through a significant portion of the school week. And so I just wanted to set up a plan where local school boards could voluntarily choose to engage in something like an education savings account, where if they weren't opening up and you have teachers that, they're frustrated with the process as well. So it would have allowed a parent to be able to allocate a portion of their tax dollars to go toward other educational alternatives. So if that meant small pods, if it meant, different online learning opportunities, if it meant that a public school teacher whose whole day is not consumed by educating is now able to engage in additional tutoring opportunities for students, maybe in a safer environment where you have fewer people in the room, it would have been able to do that. Well, that died instantly without much debate. Another bill I had was similar to what we were trying to do with respect to nurse practitioners. We were trying to remove some of the regulatory burden. I had a bill that essentially said that if you are licensed to practice medicine anywhere in the United States, then you would be automatically licensed to practice medicine in Virginia. You didn't have to go through additional loopholes or regulatory barriers in order to practice here. And again, when you're talking about trying to get as much access to medicine as possible, removing those regulatory barriers, I think is very important. And unfortunately, that was another one that didn't get a subcommittee. So, there's two examples of bills that I would have liked to have seen greater support for, and which I would have hoped we could have gotten some bipartisan support for that didn't go anywhere. I think the third bill that I was a little bit surprised on was we had a bill that said that if you employed a man or woman in the National Guard in Virginia, then we wanted to set up a grant program that would make it easier to hire people that want to serve in the Guard. And obviously our Guard has had a lot of trials put on it. They've had deployments they didn't anticipate. And when you're employing someone in the Guard and they have to get deployed, they have to get activated, that causes problems with your business. And obviously a lot of our small businesses can't afford any more, problems or surprises like that. And so we had a grant from that was a priority of the Military and Veterans Caucus. It made it out of committee, went to appropriations. It was a relatively small amount of money that we were going to allocate for this. And it got voted down. And I was a little bit surprised that the chairman of the House Military and Veterans Caucus also voted against it. And I'm sure he had his reasons. I just would have liked to have known what those reasons were before it got to the subcommittee if it wasn't going to receive the support. But again, we'll be back next year and we'll be trying again.
So, Delegate, earlier in February, HB 2098 came before you. This was Virginia Beach Delegate Cowan versus Fowler's bill that requires cities in Virginia Beach, or in Virginia, shall I say, that do districts for city council and require a candidate live in the district, and also require the registered voters in the district to be only ones capable of voting for them. You were one of the nay votes, and it would pass eventually, and now it's ready to be law. This caused some concertion in Virginia Beach, obviously, and either from those who like the district voting but think that this process is wrong, or even those who don't like district voting because they think as of it as an at-large. You had the vote in front of you. What's your take on the matter?
So whenever it comes to these local issues, I really try not to interfere too much at the state level. Obviously, being a Dillon Rule state, they require our permission for a lot of things at the state level that I don't necessarily think they should. And this was something where Delegate Converse Fowler supported it. Delegate Davis opposed it. I think Delegate Maris, I believe he opposed it as well. Mm-hmm. And my understanding is that this really was an issue of at-large versus district specific. And these are, again, typically issues that I don't want to get involved in on the local level. I think that this is something where if you needed the state to change it, again, my first question is the locality asking for it? And I got differing views with respect to whether or not people at the local level wanted this or didn't want it. And if I don't know for sure whether or not the locality wants something like this, I tend to vote no. This did follow the typical process. A lot of times we actually have the local government requesting these sorts of changes. Now, in this case, obviously you could see that if the current elected officials don't like this change, then obviously they want it requested, and therefore it might actually take a state legislator making that decision. But as I looked at my colleagues that represent that area, again, if I'm not confident that the change is something the locality wants in this particular case, then I'm not inclined to vote for it.
Would it be fair to say that you might be looking at it like you're taking the concept of federalism, but applying it to the state? So where you have a locality that really wants something, it should be the locality's decision whether or not they vote on it, as opposed to the entirety of the state.
Yeah, typically, whenever I look at a bill or a piece of legislation, I always ask 4 questions. I ask, is it constitutional? So has this authority even been delegated to us to address in the first place? A lot of my colleagues, they look at bills based off, is this a good idea or a bad idea? Well, I don't even get to that stage until I determine whether or not I have constitutional authorization to address it. The second question I ask is, do I believe it's a legitimate function of government? Clearly something like this is. And then the third question I ask is, what's the appropriate level of government to deal with this issue? And I tend to value local decisions over state and federal decisions simply because it's affecting the fewest number of people. If there's corrections that need to be made, rather than impose something statewide, allow it to be done locally. And then the fourth question I usually ask is, whatever policy is being put forward, does it protect individual liberty and private property rights? So in this case, it was one where, again, I represent Culpeper, Madison, and Orange County. This isn't something that's directly affecting me, but I'm getting mixed reviews from both people within the Virginia Beach area, as well as the delegations that represent that. And so, again, on something like that, me, typically a no vote is a little bit, I don't want to say safer, but until I really see something where the local population wants to see this happen, I'm a little bit more skeptical of us stepping in and just trying to change it from the state.
I want a little bit more background on the way Lucia and myself might look at it. If I'm not mistaken, generally, we're probably on the same idea, Lucia and I, and that we might like a little bit of district voting. It's whether or not we agree that it should be something Richmond decides for us, as opposed to something Virginia Beach does. Or, I don't want to speak for you. What was your take on the matter? Because I know mine, but what's yours?
So personally, I understand city council voted it down, and I don't agree with that, because I feel like it should have been in the hands of the voters of Virginia Beach. And I don't agree with the same approach as Converse Fowler implementing it at a state level, because it's the same situation. It's ramming their choice down our throats. It ultimately should be in the hands of the voters of Virginia Beach. It should not be delegated by city council voting it down or the state legislature voting for it. It should be ultimately down to us. If we choose that we want to go for it, then that should be ultimately us. And when I actually approached Delegate Fowler about it, Converse Fowler, she brought back legislation that happened. It was apparently a vote. It was a referendum back in the 90s that happened 25 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but I wasn't in voting age back then. Virginia Beach was a completely different makeup. And so was, I don't think she was in voting age. It was a completely different time. And if we're going to be legislating based off of data that happened 25 years ago, God forbid what comes out. So that was my argument towards her. And then she turns around and goes, well, I didn't state that it was something that was based off of 25 years ago. Well, when you provide me with evidence based off of a referendum that was completed in 94 and in 96, which was technically 25 and 27 years ago, I'm going to use that as my basis. You should have at least had a statement within that bill to make it a referendum in the next election to allow the city of Virginia Beach, because this is the only municipality, the only locality in the entire state that it affects. Mm-hmm. Let us choose. Don't ram it down our throats because you think that the makeup's going to change.
Personally, I like the idea of district voting. So just like last year, I went to council to speak for it because I wanted the referendum that Councilwoman Abbott proposed.
Yeah.
So at that moment, I'm like, hey, give us the opportunity as the city to do it. But even in that moment, it still would have needed to then leave us and then go to Richmond for them to even give us the ability to do it. So like the overall problem is, as Delegate mentioned, the Dillon rule. If it was something that we had the power to do with, this isn't even a debate that we would be having. But still, I overall, I like the idea of district voting. So I still kind of like the idea that she also represents some Virginia Beach citizens. So does Delegate Askew, Delegate Guy, but also Delegate Meares, does Delegate Knight, Delegate Davis. In a sense, Virginia Beach still had his voice, but that's just depending on, how you want to look at it.
I don't believe that state legislation outside of the entity of Virginia Beach should be dictating on whether our locality and how we operate as a localized city council. And I feel that a referendum should have been part of the bill. I think it should have left to the voters of Virginia Beach. Personally, if you're going to vote in Virginia Beach, I don't understand why I wouldn't be voting only for the people who represent me. But at the same time, it's the approach of the whole matter. Let us choose. That's what the whole point of democracy is about, is letting people speak through their votes and make their choice rather than ramming things through people's throats.
Ramming being an interesting way to put it, because there's so many different ways that the government might, want to ram things down, that we would like to have more democratic input on it. I would like to go over a little bit to, I think we want to move on to the concept of wedding venues, because the governor has started to open up more and more things. But it's interesting that wedding venues still stubbornly can't get above 25 people. Is this overall wise, Delegate, or is it something that might be seemingly arbitrary?
Well, again, I'm the guy that I'm a guy that comes, depending on who's saying, I get accused or praised for being more, liberty oriented or libertarian minded on a lot of these things. And so my usual response is give people good information, allow them to make decisions for themselves. And I think a lot of the various policies associated with, lockdowns or restricting businesses have been somewhat arbitrary, or at the very least not consistent. And I think this is one more example of it. I mean, if you look at my district, wedding venues are a huge deal out here in rural Virginia. And so the idea that we've had a lot of people that have either had to, close down their businesses, whether it's wedding venue associated or the wedding venue itself. And so I think it's something that should be open, and you allow people to make decisions, and people have to bear the consequences of their decisions. I understand that in a case like this, people often, kind of instinctively go to the argument that, well, your decision is now affecting somebody else. But again, when you're talking about some of these other venues, or when you're talking about a Costco, I go to Costco, right? There are not 25 people in that venue, right? And there's not even, it's not even restricted to the point where you have only 25 people in a space that might be the same size as a wedding venue. And so once again, it's the idea that the government's going to micromanage this process, where I think that if maybe a good compromise would be to say that, look, there's certain goals that we're trying to achieve. We're not going to tell you how to achieve it. Here's our basic guidelines. Now go forth and find new and innovative ways to be able to do it. And I think wedding venues would end up surprising you in the ways that they could set up policies that would be, cautious and responsible, but at the same token would allow, people to have a wedding with more than just their immediate family. Now, if it was me and there was only 25 people at my wedding when I got married, I would have been fine with it. But I'm not sure my wife would. So again, no, I don't know that it's arbitrary. I definitely think it's inconsistent with the way that other venues and other establishments are allowed to operate. And so I would be far more open to relaxing any number of these regulations, and then allowing people to assume risk for themselves and to be able to make their own decisions.
All right. Now, Virginia Beach and the rest of the state are rolling out vaccinations as quick as we can. However, it's not as high as many states out there. What should we do to better activate vaccination capability?
Is this for me?
Yes.
Okay. I think we have to get the private sector more involved. The idea that you're going to, and again, we've tried to do this on some levels. But it was interesting. I was reading a story the other day. I think it was in South Carolina, where they were having huge problems managing the line at a vaccination facility. And so what did the local mayor do? He called his buddy at Chick-fil-A, and he literally had the Chick-fil-A manager come down and organize the line. And all of a sudden, it started to move very quickly and effectively and efficiently, because the bottom line is, if you've ever been to Chick-fil-A, those guys know how to manage a line like nobody's business.
Wow.
And so,
Too funny.
Part of this.
Good point, though.
Yeah, well, and again, it's the whole idea that I think that you have entities all across the state, whether they be public or private, that want to do this. But when it comes to distribution, I mean, honestly, think about this. When it comes to distribution, government is not the model for effective and efficient distribution. It really is the private sector. And so I think the more that you can get the private sector involved in assisting with this, the better results that you're going to have as far as getting products or getting a product, which in this case is the vaccine, out to the people that need it the most and doing it in an effective and efficient manner. So I would like to see a lot more partnership with the private sector in getting it out there instead of kind of like this white knuckled grip that sometimes the government has. And I think they're trying to implement that on some level. I'm trying to be fair here. I don't think that there's some nefarious goal by state agencies to restrict it. I just don't think they possess the same subject matter expertise that you see within the private sector.
Okay. So you have your re-election coming up, and this year we have big races like the Attorney General, Lieutenant Governor, and Governor. Delegate teammates of yours from Virginia Beach, such as Jason Miraz and Glenn Davis, are running for positions such as Attorney General and Lieutenant Governor, respectively. What are your overall thoughts on the big races this year, and what do you think Republicans need to do to be competitive in what is seemingly a bluer and bluer state?
My God, predicting elections or telling everybody what they need to do, I think it's becoming more and more unpredictable as time goes on. I will tell you what I would like to see happen. I think we need to run. I am concerned with the way that politics is developing, and you see this, I think, on both the left and the right, where it's this idea that it's all about, I'm going to put my party in charge, so my party can tell everybody else what to do, or my party can compel people or regulate people or tax people in the way that I think is appropriate. I would like to see the Republican Party go with a message of, our job is to protect your liberty, to protect your property rights, is to provide for basic levels of security and let you live your own life, right? We're not here to tell you what to do, what to believe. We really are here to maximize liberty, because I believe that maximizing individual liberty actually maximizes opportunity, prosperity, and ultimately security. And so what I would like to see is more of an emphasis on individual liberty, individual choice, and allowing, again, people to just live their lives without constant government interference. And I think that if we can capture that message, and then we can articulate how that message actually creates more opportunity, how it creates more choices and opportunity within our education system, how it creates more choices and opportunity within our healthcare system, how it creates, better, security. I think that's good, but that's going to be the big question, right? Is can we tie the philosophical to those tabletop discussions that are really affecting people? I mean, one of the biggest issues right now for a lot of voters is they want their kids back in school. And the question is getting elected, who's going to be able to deliver on that? And I don't just mean, virtual education, but who's going to be able to deliver on a package that actually empowers, teachers, parents, students to work together to be able to get their kids back in school. And then I would say, building on that, it's like, how do we, now that we know what happens when all of a sudden you have something like a pandemic and the government has almost monopolistic control over education, how do we create an environment that is more responsive to something like this, and by the same token, more responsive to the individual educational needs of children? Because I have a real problem with a government one-size-fits-all solution, and I think that's one area where Republicans can really differentiate themselves. And then when it comes to economic opportunity, I think expanding things like career technical education, I think looking at ways that we remove regulatory burdens that make it very difficult to be able to start a business, expand a business. I think removing some of the regulatory burdens that make it difficult for people to be able to set up home businesses. That was another thing that we've seen. If someone has the ability to be able to work remotely, that can be a huge advantage when you have something like COVID going on, and as well as being just an advantage generally within the marketplace. And then obviously there's going to be some other issues too that I think affect people. Broadband has been a big issue. And I think we also need to be honest about the fact that we're not going to be able to dig fiber optic cable everywhere in the Commonwealth within the next couple of years. So how do we do a better job with, again, removing the regulatory and tax burdens that make it difficult for other people to be able to provide internet services to those people that need it? Because if what's going on right now is any indication of the future, then I do think that we're steadily moving back to some degree of normalcy, but there's still going to be some of these restrictions in place. And I think that's unfortunate, but the best thing to talk about then is how do we navigate that? And obviously providing better access to things like internet services is going to be something that I think a lot of the candidates will be talking on. But ultimately, my hope is that Republicans are not campaigning an idea that if you put us in charge, we'll force people to do Republican things. I want it to be, I want us to be the party of individual liberty, of opportunity, of individual choice. That's what I want us to be the party of. And I certainly hope our candidates' messaging strategy will reflect that.
I completely agree. Being from, I have a daughter who was a kindergartner last year when the virtual learning hit back. Actually, when we got the email on March 13th, luckily I was able to work from home so I could be able to help her. But I could not fathom having a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old try to work through a Chromebook. And they need that social interaction as much as they need that education. It's part of their whole growing process. And my daughter has gone and bounced around between virtual and back in the classroom. And I completely agree with you on the Republicans. They need to push more liberty instead of having all this control implemented. And I remember Jason Miraz made the comment after the Democrats took full control over the legislature and the representatives, House of Representatives and the Senate. And he said, Democrats lose like they're never going to win, but they win like they're never going to lose. And exactly what they just did is perfect detail. And he said this before it even went into fruition. And I think that's incredibly loud.
Yeah, and honestly, I give Democrats credit for this. I don't necessarily like the results, but I give them credit for this. I was talking to Jason. I said, when Democrats are in the minority, they act like they're in the majority. When they're in the majority, they act like there'll never be another election cycle. So yeah, we'll see what happens.
And I'd like to see more Republicans step up and actually run instead of having all these non-contested races.
Yeah,
Interesting.
absolutely.
Hey, Nick, we have a couple of questions from the good friend, Tavoris Marks, good friend of the show. He asks, are you pleased with the pro-Trump path that the Republican Party is headed down, already on? He predicts that this route will be the destruction of the Republican Party. Your thoughts?
So, this has always kind of bothered me. When Trump first was seeking office, I supported, Rand Paul, and then I supported Ted Cruz. When Trump became our candidate, I voted for him, and I was really concerned based off of some of the previous positions he'd taken, some of the things he'd said. Now, when he actually got into the process of governing, I actually liked a lot of his policies. Everything from, when it talks about like foreign policy, he actually had a much more guarded foreign policy than a lot of previous presidents, both Republican and Democrat. He was actually less aggressive in many respects when it came to large-scale military engagement. When it came to criminal justice reform, he passed the most comprehensive criminal justice reform that I supported of any president in my lifetime. And then when it came to tax policy and regulatory policy, I actually thought he did a really good job on a lot of that. And so, but here's my issue. Politics should not be a cult of personality. Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, Green, I don't care. It should not be a cult of personality. It really should be a discussion about ideas and about philosophy and about policy. And what is that policy going to actually achieve? And so, like with any other Republican politician, I look at the policy they advocate, and when I agree with them, I agree with them. And when I disagree, I disagree. So I don't think, for me, it's not about Trump. For me, it's like the Republican Party. No political party should be completely defined by a particular member of that party. It should be defined by its platform, its ideals, and its policy positions. And so that's what we need to do a better job of advocating going forward.
Intriguing. Tavoris gave you the thumbs down on that. But, okay. The party of individual choice. Republicans want to tell women what to do with their bodies. Where is the individual choice? I thought this was kind of intriguing because this is one of those sticky areas. I remember I had a debate with my family members, about this. So you may not know this about me, Nick. I started off as a Democrat in the early 90s, and then I listened to Rush Limbaugh in 91 and was a Republican for a while. And then I started really watching and becoming more politically savvy, and I saw the hypocrisy in both parties. So that's when I became an independent. And I think that some of the values and some of the concerns are valid, but at some point, I think he goes off the rails. And so when Tavoris brings this point up about, telling women what to do with their bodies, where's the individual choice there? What's your response? I'll share mine afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I don't want to tell women what to do with their bodies. I really don't want to tell anybody else what to do with their bodies. The question is what happens when your actions affect another human being? And so the question on abortion for me has always been a question of when does human life begin? And if I look at all the scientific criteria that we use in biology in order to distinguish between, a living entity and a non-living entity, right? So we use things like reproductive capacity, growth, the ability to turn, food into energy, et cetera. When I look at all those criteria, what I find is that a child in the womb meets all the scientific criteria to be a living entity. Next question we have to ask is it a human entity, right? Is it a human life? Well, the way we distinguish human life and non-human life is through characteristics and things like deoxyribonucleic acid, right? DNA. So again, the question comes down to at what point do you meet all the scientific criteria to be human, to be life? Well, at the point of conception, you meet all of that scientific criteria. Now, people can argue all day long about sentience. They can argue all day long about any number of things, but if you believe in individual liberty and you believe in individual choice, well, a key component of that is the idea that every human being has inherent worth and is therefore entitled to certain unalienable rights. And if you are a human being in the womb, well, then you are entitled to certain basic rights. Among those is life. And so so I don't want to tell anybody what to do with their body, but the whole basis of law is about human interaction, and it's specifically about involuntary human interaction. When somebody does something that affects the life, liberty, property of somebody else, that is typically when we view that as an appropriate intervention by government in order to protect somebody. And so that's why I look at it as if it's innocent human life, which I think it clearly is by all scientific and legal definitions, then it's entitled to that basic protection. Now, by the same token, one of the issues I take with a lot of pro-life Republicans is they talk a lot about this from the legal concept, but they don't do much about it from the practical concept. And so I've spent a lot of time actually working with organizations that come alongside women that have an unplanned pregnancy, that aren't sure if they want to keep a child, and they actually provide resources, whether they be medical, whether they be meeting physical needs, such as, who's going to help you either raise this child or who's going to help you provide the physical things you're going to need in order to provide for the child. I believe this is a comprehensive approach. But with respect to government intervention in this choice, once your choice affects another human being, in this case, ends another human being's life, well, then I do think there's a reasonable avenue there for the government to come in and say, no, we have an obligation to protect innocent human life. And so that's where I stand on that issue, because even when a pregnancy is unplanned, right, the vast majority of abortions that take place, according to places like the Guttmacher Institute, which is a pro-choice organization, it's somewhere around 96% of abortions are not a result of rape. They're not a result of incest. They're not a result of significant health concerns with respect to the mother. It's a result of two people choosing to engage in an activity, in this case, sexual intercourse, which both of them know can bring about the creation of another human being, and deciding to do it anyways. Well, now that's a consequence of a choice. And if the follow-on choice is I'm going to eliminate that innocent human life, well, I do think that innocent human life is also worthy of protection.
Interesting. I know that ruffled a couple of feathers when you shared that and that concept in our last stream. Salute to John Edgell. I know we'll get a message from John coming in pretty quickly. That the concept of abortion and being policy and being regulated has always been intriguing to me. As much as I like what you were saying, one of the things that I keep coming back to is, after my wife gave birth to my children, I would kill anybody who tried to harm them. Mm-hmm. I'm still surprised that Devik Chauvin is around. That should have been handled. I would hurt anyone who tried and harm my child. And truthfully, while my child was in vitro, I would have harmed and possibly killed anyone who tried to harm my child. So does that extend to the person who's carrying the child? And I've struggled with that question, and
that's what I want to touch on.
I struggle with that question, but the truth is, yes, because I have to defend my child, and it's a bit challenging. And so I don't know that there's a real easy answer, because I really don't necessarily see it as just the woman's body when part of me is in that, that creation. Now, I know, Alicia, you wanted to jump in and share your motherly thoughts. So go ahead, Mom.
I am the female in the situation. So when you mentioned like the Republicans saying that, or somebody comments stating that the Republicans are trying to tell women what they can and cannot do with their bodies, I don't necessarily state it as that. Nick is very right with the whole, when does human life start? Does it start at conception? Does it start when the child is born? In one of the most liberal states in the entire United States, which is California, as we all know, Lacey Peterson passed away in 2004 because she was convicted because her husband killed her, and he was convicted. Not only was he convicted of first-degree murder on her behalf, but he was also convicted on second-degree murder of killing their unborn son. So obviously the state of California identified that unborn child was a life. So I don't understand how they can state at 8 months that child is in her womb, how when they say that you can be able to do abortion up to the day of having the child. I just don't understand that. So, but at the same time, I don't see the Republicans saying that you can or cannot. It's just valuing life. And ultimately, what is the most value? Like, is it conception? Is it when the child's born? But I think a lot of it has to do with the conception. It's just the whole perception of things, and that's always, I think, the problem with a lot of sides is people's perception of how things are defined.
Interesting. One value in life.
One of the things, if I could put in here, here's what I find interesting about the question. Like, when they phrase it as, why do you think you have a right to tell a woman what to do with her body? Let's actually look at the underlying assumption there. The underlying assumption there is obviously that you shouldn't tell someone what to do with their own body. Okay, well, why? Why shouldn't you? I mean, I happen to agree that you shouldn't do that, but why shouldn't you? Well, it's because we value not only the sanctity of your life, but we also value the agency or the ownership that you have over your body. And so if we're going to make the argument about telling someone what to do or what not to do with their body, well, then the question is the other part of this equation, the child, is that also a body?
Yep.
Do they also have value and worth as a result of that? And if the answer is yes, well then, again, it kind of turns the question on the head. The underlying assumption behind the whole, someone's body, not telling them what to do with it, is the assumption that it's not only valuable, but they have some sort of ownership over it, and it's worthy of protection of the government, or that somebody else shouldn't tell them what to do until you use your body to harm another body, right? The only way that argument really stands up is that if we assume that you have value, that your body has value, the moment you become a living human being. And again, I think the scientific criteria determines the starts at conception.
Absolutely.
I came close to bringing this in on one of the prepared questions, but I took it out. That's because I was reading somewhere along the past couple of days that there was one guy in Texas who wanted to put forth a bill that would have expanded the possibility of the death penalty for women who were seeking abortions. And it was singing like that is just, maybe that was a bill that was done specifically to generate news or something like that. But it touches on the idea that you wanted to use government in that fashion to touch on the agency of the woman who wanted to use that right to choose in that instance. I don't necessarily want to disagree with the idea that actually is human life, but that doesn't then deny a woman her own human life and her own rights to decide regarding her body. So this is where the law actually sort of divides by zero and has an error in itself, because how are you going to determine which one wins? in that scenario.
Well, I think the question there comes down to the issue of first cause.
Mhm.
So for instance, I don't, yes, I have the right over my body, but I think it was Justice Wendell Holmes that said that my right to swing my arm is limited by the proximity of your face, right? Or something like that. So it's a question of how did the baby get there in the first place? Well, presumably in most cases, the baby got there as a result of two people knowingly engaging in an activity with their bodies, using their agency, understanding that the potential consequence was another human life. And so it's not quite the same thing of the baby's agency versus the mother's agency versus the father's agency. It's that the first cause was two people decided to engage in sexual intercourse, knowing they could bring about a human life. The presence of the baby is just the natural process by which, children are born. And so the child at this point is in defense. They're the one actually just, again, attempting to live and grow and develop within the mechanism that nature has assigned for that process. And so first cause is really important here. Again, you don't have a right to punch me in the face, but if I do something to you and you're defending yourself, well, then you do have a right. And so that's where I think the distinction has to be made is with respect to cause.
All right, we're going to try a little experiment here, Mr. Nick, and have you jump off the stream and then jump back on the stream because I think it's getting a little choppy. And then we'll just try to see if that might help it out a little bit.
Okay.
Definitely love to have them back because still got about 2 more questions that I at least want to ask. Plus, I think there might be a couple more viewer questions down the line. But that's definitely the type of discussion I like to have more on, not specifically because of the topic, just the idea that we're having a good discussion.
Right. And I tell you, the abortion piece is such a challenge. It's touchy in so many ways, and I really don't think that either the how did I can't think of the guy's name right now, but he called it the Republicrats and the Democrats or whatever he called them. I don't think either side has come up with a good solution for it. So, and I think Nick is back. Hey.
That's good.
I'm back. So get rid of me that easy, Conrad.
No. I want
to. What? It's still there, but I think we're going to have to roll with it.
That's fine. I think most of what he's saying we're able to hear, and that's the good part of this. I want to roll into my next prepared question, and this is sort of on the nod at the beginning of the last question: how Virginia is being perceived more and more of a bluer state, whether or not that's fixed or not. I'm curious about the Republicans want to sort of campaign on going forward. And I'm not going to take my heart off my sleeve in here and deny that I'm a Democrat or something like that. I am. But we're here to address in a nice discussion what is the future like for what Republicans want to brand themselves as and run for. Basically, do they look to be the proactive party or the reactionary party? And bear with me a bit as you have all the grains of salt you need for my progressive value on this, but I'll give an example of reactionary. The COVID bill that was just passed provides trillions in direct relief both to individuals and families and governments. It has about 76% approval rating overall, and even a majority of the Republicans actually approve it. Republicans are people in the population, but not necessarily the politicians themselves. Republican senators like Roger Wicker laud how it will help their constituents, but every Republican politician, Senates and the House, when given the chance to vote for it, they voted against it. So it looks like taking both sides for the sake of expedience. Then you have this culture war that's coming up. Everyone's wanted to fight about cancel culture. Personally, it seems like these are topics that are created as a way to be a distraction when we're not addressing other more powerful issues like trying to solve poverty or social justice or healthcare. And it just seems the brand is that the Democrats are the one fighting for that and the Republicans are on the sideline for that. So I'm not saying Republicans are running for it, but how would they want to run for it in the future on those important issues? And I would like to see what your vision is on that.
Well, I think, can you guys hear me all right?
Very well this time, yes.
Mm-hmm. Great. I think when it comes to things like the COVID stimulus package, there was reasons to like it. There was reasons not to like it. I mean, that's typical legislation. But I do think that there was a lot of problems with respect to how spending was prioritized in some of these situations. I mean, you had hundreds of millions, sometimes billions of dollars going to things that I would argue are nowhere near COVID related. It's actually one of the things that I think is structurally wrong with the way that especially the federal government handles these sorts of bills. I'm actually a big advocate of our germaneness policy, or our kind of one issue per bill policy that we have in Virginia. Now, it's not executed flawlessly, but it's far better than what they have in Washington, D.C., where essentially they have all this back deal horse trading going on, where now you take, trillions of dollars and you start packing it with all sorts of things that if the average voter was really aware of everything that's packed into that, you would have some that would say, okay, I don't like that, but I mean, I need to get the stuff that we need. You'd have other people that say, no, that's ridiculous. I mean, no mention of the fact that all of this money, like a large portion of this money, is just borrowed. This is future debt against future generations. This is not something that we have sitting in the treasury somewhere. And so I think that structurally, one of the ways that Republicans can actually run on something like this is you can take the COVID bill and you could say, look, there was a lot of things that we all agreed on. Why couldn't we have voted on the things that we agreed on, allow that money to go forward, and then individually vote on some of the other bills that we're going through in order to decide, where we were, and then let the American people decide, not on some large omnibus package, but to essentially say that, look, this is what Republicans think should be prioritized with respect to COVID spending. This is what Democrats think should be prioritized with respect to COVID spending, and then have an easy, up or down vote on those individual expenditures, or at least expenditures that kind of make sense with one another. I think that goes back to basic government transparency. Both parties are 100% guilty of playing this backroom horse trading deal, where they stick a bunch of stuff on a bill that has nothing to do with the underlying reason for the bill, and then shoving it through and daring the other side to vote against it. Because the message now is, Republicans are going to come out and say, we had all this spending on the Kennedy Center, and Democrats are going to say, you voted against people getting checks when they really needed it. And in reality, there's elements of truth, but the real problem is the structural process. And some of this, I lay a lot of blame at the feet of Republicans, because it was Speaker Ryan that said that any bill that was going before the House had to first be approved by the Rules Committee, which is dominated by leadership and gets to decide whether or not a bill even sees the light of day in a committee. And then Pelosi decided to keep that rule. So, no, there's plenty of blame to go around on this stuff. But again, from a structural standpoint, I think a lot of people, you ask the issue of one issue per bill to the voting public, and you get over 70% of the voting public saying, I like the idea of one issue per bill. Not because it's going to change the differences that we have between Republicans and Democrats, but because it's going to make it a lot easier for the voting population to actually see what is being voted on and why it's being voted against, or why you're voting in favor of it. And so I don't think it's fair to just say that, well, Republicans wanted both sides of the issue. No, I think there's things Republicans liked within the COVID spending bill. There's a lot of things that they didn't like. And I think that's a fair critique. You can disagree, but I think that's a fair critique. With respect to cancel culture, this idea that this is just manufactured, I mean, I don't see a lot of Republicans trying to cancel Dr. Seuss, right? or Mr. Potato Head, and the idea that this isn't at all relevant. Well, no. I mean, politics is downstream from culture, and I think it was I don't know, remember, it was Wordsworth, or it was a British poet that said, "Let me write the songs of a nation. I care not who write its laws." With the underlying idea there being that culture has a huge influence on politics and on the way that we interact and we discuss things. And so I do think there is some genuine concern over cancel culture. And again, even that is not all one-sided. It's not just the left who engage in cancel culture. The right also has its version of cancel culture at times, but I do think we're seeing it more prominently displayed on the left, because when it comes to those cultural institutions, the left tends to have a lot more power than the right. So I don't think that's manufactured. I do think a lot of people are frustrated by that, especially when it's affecting things, or certain institutions or ideas, or again, things like, Dr. Seuss that we all grew up with.
Oh no, he's horrible. If you watch his earlier pictures, his white supremacist pictures that he made before he became famous are what many of us said, oh, forget him a long time ago. I'm surprised that people are just getting caught up with it. Now, do we love his books? Do we love Cat in the Hat? Yes. Love the book. Mm-hmm. Did we love the other book on the house? Yes. But some of the other stuff he did was horrible. And I'm surprised people are just now getting caught up with it. But that's the point of cancel. It's not the point of it. It's just intriguing about cancel culture is it brings up things that people should have paid attention to a long time ago.
I would jump in to say that it wasn't like a groundswell of big grassroots efforts for progressives, myself, or something like, wait, that's Dr. Seuss. We got to get rid of him. It was the publishing company that owned the rights. They're like, you know what? We're no longer going to sell 6 of his 60 books. Then the news saw that, and then they're like, hey, this is a bigger news story. And now that's stuff that we hear about in the news. We didn't need to hear more of the story. That's not.
I'm going to show what I'm talking about. I'm going to, because most people don't know this, and once they see it, they're like, oh, okay, maybe those 6 books were cool to be removed because the rest of the stuff he made was great.
Well, Seko, under that premise, we should have removed Governor Northam.
Ooh.
Okay.
And Woodrow Wilson and FDR, and this list goes on and on.
I truly, I agree with those.
These are discussions we've had.
We've had some horrible leaders in America. They've done some horrible things in America. So bring the list on. Bring the list on.
So in terms of, I agree with Nick and, with the cancel culture and the Republicans and this COVID relief package and how they added all this stuff to it. I'm one who has student loans, and I don't think everybody should have to pay my student loans. I'm in my career to the capacity I'm at, and because I've taken on student loans. And there are people out there that have never never had a higher education. So I think that there's a lot of things that were thrown into this bill that they pushed through because they had majority and they could do whatever they want and they know it. I think this is just the beginning. I feel honestly like they're just printing off money, the federal government right now, because this is not money that we have. I feel like we're going to start seeing the rate of inflation increase substantially. Come on, gas has already increased substantially in the past 3-4 weeks. So I think this is only the beginning. And it's a change of administration. It's a change of political administration and affiliation. And we have the next 2 years, we have a nothing but Democratic Congress that is fulfilled by an executive and executive branch as well to back it up. So whatever they send to him, I feel like they're finishing what Obama wasn't able to complete. But we're just in a completely different environment because of the COVID situation.
What did he want to complete?
I think a lot of it had to do with finishing up whatever he needed to clean up on his healthcare on the Obamacare deal. Honestly, I don't agree with a president who comes in within weeks and automatically starts bombing another country and putting us ultimately into another war. Trump didn't even put us in a war for 4 years. And everybody wants to talk about how such a bad person he was. We didn't go into war. And it made me, because my husband was on deployment in 2015, who was literally had an Iranian ship following it while he was on the Theodore Roosevelt on a 9-month deployment. I feel like there's a lot of things that are going to come to terms. And we're going to see a lot of things get pushed through for the next 2 years. And it's going to ultimately affect a lot of people more, I think, detrimentally than successfully.
Now, I would approach that from the idea of the progressive, and I would really like an overall reduction of what is seemingly United States imperialism. So I wouldn't want to see all these wars. So you and I should be on the same page with that. So yeah, let's say we give Trump credence for not starting one, but it's not like he ended action in Somalia. He also assassinated an Iranian general.
He was a bad guy.
Yeah, there's a lot of bad guys in the world, but this is extrajudicial. And it is also a situation that we only did a little bit of reduction in troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. We still have, a lot of troops there. We need to bring them all home. At least that would be my opinion.
You can't enter in another third country such as Afghanistan and Iraq. You cannot just completely deploy. And Nick would know because he's military. He's a veteran.
Hey, And I'm not taking our side away from this, because remember Biden, and I think it was a debate against Paul Ryan where it was like, in 2 years, we're going to be out, period. And we're still there. So this is seemingly something that is, I can scream to the high heavens, nothing happens. Republicans can scream to the high heavens, nothing happens. But what if we all scream together? Why does
I do think you're seeing more, and honestly, this is one of the obligations I think I have. I mean, when I was in my the one debate I got with Conrad and Spanberger, and we got asked about national defense policy, I came right out and I said, no, we need to pull our troops home from Afghanistan. And again, I'm a former Green Beret. I have 2 combat tours over in Iraq. I'm very proud of my service. I'm very proud of the work that we did in many respects. But I have a real problem with U.S. foreign policy, specifically with going to war, primarily because I feel like Congress has completely abdicated its responsibility to the executive branch. And if it is important enough to send men and women into combat, then it's important enough to take a damn vote. And Congress has been more than happy ever since the 1960s to essentially abdicate that responsibility over to the executive branch. So when the war is going well, they can say, yeah, we're right there with you. And when the war is going badly, as wars inevitably do on some level, they can come back and say, well, it's not our war. No, it sure as hell is, because you didn't do your job with respect to having a debate and actually committing to what it was you were supporting. And so I will fight alongside anybody. I'm a Frederick Douglass fan, right? One of my favorite quotes from Frederick Douglass is, I will work with anybody to do good, and I will work and nobody to do evil. And so when I find issues like this, I can work with people. I am all about saying, yeah, hey, there's no reason we can't stand up together and fight for that. Yeah.
No, I like that. Yeah, I'm a Frederick Douglass fan as well. We'll do with that. But just to amplify what I was saying a little earlier, yeah, this was the I love his other books.
Yeah, that's not good.
Love his other books.
I can't even see.
We've been talking about this stuff for 20 or 30 years, and it's amazing to me that America is just kind of waking up and saying, hey, maybe some of the things we should just pull away, and we'll covet the other things.
And I would like to think that if it wasn't for the news taking it the way they did it, this is from the company itself, the production company that decided to remove that. It's not like people are trying to pass a law that cancels literally Dr. Seuss. It's like, hey, look at this. This was bad. We're going to get rid of it.
No. And look, I'm all for people in the private sector making decisions with respect to what they want to do and what they don't want to do. Right? I'm all for that. And one of the biggest important things of freedom of speech is it's protecting unpopular speech, even speech that you despise, you disagree with. Right? Yep. That's a key component of it. Popular speech doesn't require protection, generally speaking. But I do think that the larger part of cancel culture with respect to how it potentially affects policy is when you do see more and more people that are essentially saying that, freedom of speech needs to be severely curtailed if it provides offense. And you are seeing a growing push for this. And if you think it can't happen here, go look at the speech laws in the UK, go look at the speech laws within Canada. They do not have the same, they don't have a First Amendment, so they don't have the same protections on speech. And there is a genuine concern that we're moving in this direction, that if speech is somehow offensive, well, then the government should come in and assert itself and start to regulate it. And my biggest question to that has always been, okay, you might like that idea when your side is in power. I guarantee you're not going to like it when the other side's in power. And so the overall goal has been, we're going to protect all of it, because the government should not have that kind of power. And I think that's where you see a logical connection between certain concerns within cancel culture and potential policy decisions. And then you also see it too with respect to big tech. I mean, the idea that Parler could just be taken down overnight like that, I think really shocked a lot of people. I know I was shocked by it.
Yep.
And so that's where I think there's reasonable concerns there. And honestly, there's reasonable concerns for anybody that would consider themselves a champion of civil liberties. And that's really what this is about. And this is another area where I would hope that liberals and conservatives can come together and say, look, regardless of what our disagreements are, we should both be able to talk about our disagreements without fear of government censorship.
Interesting. We had a couple of questions from viewers. And do you believe that certain cultural institutions or objects should be canceled. And I think you just kind of tapped into that with your last statement.
Yeah, it's the idea of who's doing the canceling, right? If individual, I think, when it's individual people within the marketplace either choosing to take their money or their time somewhere else, or if it's a company deciding they're not going to do something, then if I disagree with the company, then I don't have to do business with the company, right? There's no violence involved in that sort of canceling. All right, and then we can all have our opinions. We can all have our discussions. If you don't like something, you don't got to do business with them. If you don't like that somebody is catching heat within social media or within the public sphere, and you want to help them by doing more business with them, you can do that. My biggest concern is anytime I start to get the feeling that government is doing the canceling. That's where I have concerns.
And
that's interesting that
you
use the term violence with cancel culture. Mm-hmm. I must be missing something.
No, violence with government.
Yeah.
Okay. Just want to make sure I got that right.
Yeah. No, the primary distinction between the private sector, or just people and communities in general, and the government is the government gets to use violence in order to achieve its end states, or gets to use the threat of violence in order to achieve its end states.
Or real violence.
That's a primary difference. There is nothing government does that the private sector can't also do in some capacity. The difference is when the government does it, there's a lot of force coming behind it. That's why I always laugh when I hear a politician say, all we're asking. Laws don't ask you to do anything. They tell you to do things, and they punish you if you don't comply. And so that's why I put so much emphasis on leaving as much as possible to individuals, families, communities to make their own decisions within the voluntary nature of the marketplace, as opposed to the coercive nature of political intercourse.
Understood. Hey, we had another question from Sandy. And hey, viewers, if you have a question, keep it brief. It just does not show up well when you have the Conrad questions.
Mine can get long too.
Whew, okay. This week on the House floor, Representative Glenn Grothman, among a list of grievances toward the new rescue package, that the bill increased in the earning income tax credit for single people, seeing that as a marriage penalty. He then explained that the penalty was included because the strength that Black Lives Matter had in this last election, before claiming, I know it's a group that doesn't like the old-fashioned family. Well, that's intriguing, yeah, because the Black Lives Matter organization is not really supportive of the traditional family. So that part is true. But the movement for Black Lives might be different. And I think a lot of times people mix those up, which is one of the reasons you rarely ever hear me say, I don't think I've ever said, BLM until I read that. Your thoughts on what Representative Glenn Grothman has made?
I mean, I'm having to sit here and assume about what he meant. And what I assume what he meant by that was there's a section within the Black Lives Matter website. And again, the distinction you just made, right? It's like Black Lives Matter as a statement is unequivocally true. Black Lives Matter as the specific organization does have a portion on their website where they talk about wanting to kind of dispel this idea of what you might call the traditional of the nuclear family, right? Mother, father, children.
Right.
So I don't know if the congressman was essentially referencing that plank of BLM as an organization. I would just have to assume. I didn't actually see the speech itself. I mean, I think the questioner did a good job of trying to provide context to it. But again, I don't. When the congressman is making that assumption about what motivated people to do a particular thing, I'm not as keen on trying to guess everybody's individual motivations. Regardless of whether or not you like a particular tax policy or not, you can come up with any sort of reasons on that based off of what you think it's going to achieve or what you think potential unintended consequences are going to be. What sort of incentive structure does it create? That's a big thing I always emphasize to people is whenever you're looking at policy, spend about 5 seconds on the stated intentions of the politician and spend about 5 hours looking at the incentive structure that's created, because that's what's going to tell you how it actually works in real life. But the best I can do is I can assume that what he's suggesting is that Black Lives Matter as the organization doesn't necessarily agree with typical notions of what we would call a traditional or nuclear family. And I don't think he's being inaccurate when he makes that comment. I mean, he published it on their website, but I don't know what motivated various people to include certain spending or take out certain spending.
Interesting. Last question from our viewers. Out of the 3 COVID bills that were signed, what did you like and what did you not like?
I think when it came to funding that was specifically allocated for things that I think most of us would associate with COVID release. So if it was assisting with nursing homes, if it was assisting with vaccine production or getting vaccines out to people, or helping with first responders and medical personnel, I think most of that was pretty good. I still have some problems with the way some of it was allocated or distribution methods, but ultimately I think there was aspects of that spending that you could look at and you could say, okay, look, we're dealing with a pandemic. Does the federal government have some role with respect to the allocation of federal resources in order to support that? And I think you can make an argument. I mean, some people would say, no, the federal government has no role. Others people would say it's supposed to control it all. I think you can make an argument that some of that spending was appropriate. But again, when you look at some of the incentive structures, one of the things that I do think was problematic is that when you are telling hospitals and whatnot that they're going to get more money with respect to money that's allocated for them for COVID causes, well, now you've created a perverse incentive where theoretically a hospital is chalking things up to COVID that might not be directly associated to it, or they're not providing care in other areas that are also desperately needed. So I certainly don't have as much heartburn with those allocations that were very closely tied toward the allocation of federal resources for medical purposes that were directly related to COVID. A lot of the other stuff I think was somewhat problematic. I also would have had less heartburn with certain allocation that was specifically related to government lockdown policy. So if the government is going to say, we're going to lock you down and not allow you to actually operate your business, well then, I would prefer it in the form of saying, okay, then we're not going to tax you during this time either. I think honestly, one of the best things that we did during COVID, and some of this was state and some of it was federal, had nothing to do with money. It had everything to do with removing regulatory barriers that made it very difficult for people to actually get access to healthcare because of the litany of regulations at the federal and state levels that prevent people from seeking care across state lines, or prevent doctors, nurses, and other medical professionals from being able to provide services across state lines. And so you saw that in Virginia, you saw it on the federal level with respect to things like telemedicine, with respect to licensure reciprocity and making it easier for people to actually get access to healthcare. I think some of the best work we did was on removing regulatory burdens. And again, it didn't really cost us a dime to do so.
All right. I want to sort of touch on a little bit on Black Lives Matter and your specific framing of the idea that violence could be from the government itself, because it basically has a monopoly of it, and wrap it into my last prepared question of the night. And it's ironic that I was told that some of my questions are brief because this one's going to be very long. But here it is. Delegate, I'm appreciative you're looking to reform civil asset forfeiture, and you wish to join in, I think, on changing some drug laws. It gives me hope that Republicans in general could be more interested in reform across the board like that. And I do mean reform also on things like policing. Just in Virginia Beach, council voted to not give subpoena and investigative powers to a civilian review board for police infractions. They voted to not be able to discipline law enforcement. For the state, we fell short on eliminating qualified immunity, a reform that is a reform because it should instigate law enforcement all over to not train themselves so harshly and thusly treat much of the citizenry so harshly. Republicans are the party that they run against tyranny, and I know many call Democrats like Northam a tyrant for COVID regulations, but the Democrat Party is the party sort of running on liberalizing drug laws and reforming the power apparatus, aka the police state, or how they like to, not like, but or somehow made to tyrannize certain communities. I think if Republicans jump in and try to reform those issues too, then it would put a lot of pressure on Democrats to maintain their voting blocks. And would you similarly see it that way?
Yeah, well, I mean, when it comes to law enforcement reform, the question I always go back to is, okay, what do you mean by that, right? Because we can put you can put the reform on anything, and all of a sudden it's this idea that if you disagree with a particular policy, you're against reform. So let's take qualified immunity. I actually agree with Justice Clarence Thomas that there needs to be significant reform with respect to qualified immunity. Now, does that mean you get rid of it altogether? That, I think, is potentially problematic, and that goes back to the idea of what do we want to see within a police force? Well, I want a community-based police force, and I think there's certain things that contribute to that, and I think there's certain things that potentially take away from that. Reforming qualified immunity to draw very, very clear lines around it, I think makes sense, but to get rid of it altogether, you're now creating a scenario where every time an officer has to make a very difficult decision and does so in good faith, and it doesn't look good, or even a civilian review board that has no real experience with actually enforcing the law in dangerous situations, that can now potentially cause this person to not just lose their job, but to lose everything, lose their home. You are creating an incentive structure when that officer gets a call that we've got an armed robbery in progress. I think all of us expect that officer is going to show up and protect innocent life. But now they have to sit in their car and they got to think to themselves, well, if they show up in time and I get into a gunfight, I stand a high chance of getting in trouble for that. If I sit in my cruiser and I wait 10 minutes and I show up and I take a report, I don't get in trouble for that. So again, there's a potentially perverse incentive structure that I don't think any of us want to see. Let's take another example, no-knock warrants. Mm-hmm. I'm actually a fan of reforming no-knock warrant policy. But the idea that but again, the bill that we received was not, we're going to reform no-knock warrants, because there's been a huge uptick in no-knock warrants across the country. And a lot of that is because they want the no-knock warrant so they can prevent destruction of evidence. Okay. I think that's problematic, because now you're entering into this cost-benefit analysis of an officer is going to go into a situation that's going to be very, very vulnerable. Isn't that how they end? If they don't know the police are coming, if they're a concealed carry holder and all they see is someone banging through the door, well, then, yeah, they might be inclined to use their firearm to protect themselves, not knowing it's the police. And so reforming no-knock warrants makes absolute sense to me. But we were asked to totally get rid of it altogether. Okay, well, now you're coming into a situation where law enforcement have to go into an environment where you know that the people on the other side of the door are armed, they're willing to go down fighting, they're willing to start shooting. And now, not only is it not safe for the officer that has to serve that warrant, it's not safe for anybody in that neighborhood that could get hit by a stray bullet. It's the same thing with hostage rescue. If you have a situation where you actually have to go in and get a hostage, are you honestly telling me that we can't have a no-knock warrant in that particular situation? And so I do think that there is a good, nuanced way to go about this, where we say that we understand that policing can be an incredibly difficult job. And we don't want to create a situation where we create perverse incentives within our police force. We don't want to create a situation where there's this us versus them mentality between the community and the police department that's serving that particular community. By the same token, the pendulum shouldn't go the other way, where we treat the police like they're just the enemy. And we're going to take away some tools that actually have some relevance in creating the sort of police force that we want. If you want to see some good research on the problems that I think that we've experienced within law enforcement, a lot of it has not been the fault of police officers who live at the business end of every stupid idea a politician has. Go look at the consolidation movement, which really started picking up steam in the 70s and 80s, where all of a sudden we started taking these small community police departments that were very connected to the communities they were serving, and we consolidated into these large metropolitan police departments. Now, there's some argument to be made for consolidation when it comes to resources that aren't used as commonly, and having different departments share those resources makes sense. But when all of a sudden you have these very large departments, and you can go talk to police officers, where if they want to move up the chain, if they want to move, they're required to serve in multiple different divisions. So they don't get to actually build that tie with the community, where they really understand the community that they're serving, and the people in that community feel a trust and a bond that has been built with them over years that is taken to develop. And so, but if you look at the consolidation movement, a big push of that was coming from the feds. So, once again, I think part of the solution is getting the federal government out of the way and allowing for more community-based, policing, where the community is actually involved in that process and very connected to the individual police officers that are serving them. And just about every police officer I know wants that as well. But unfortunately, sometimes when we're very metrics focused, which a lot of times government spending is allocated based off of metrics, as opposed to genuinely, community oriented outcomes, that's where you see law enforcement agencies focusing on things that are not necessarily community priorities, but they're priorities for that, police department in order to get the funds that they need. It's one of the reasons why I didn't like civil asset forfeiture, is that you create this hostile environment where now the police department has an incentivized to take your property, even though you've never been convicted of a crime, because it goes right into their budget. I'm sorry, that's a perverse incentive. So I do think there's a lot of space where people can come together and work on these issues, but it can't just be this all or nothing component. And that was one of the big problems that I had with some of the so-called criminal justice reform when it came to things like completely ending qualified immunity or completely ending knock warrants. Again, reform would be, let's look at these, find out if there's an actual valid use case. And for those areas that there's not, let's prevent it from being used in those situations. But those areas that there are, let's write very clear laws so we understand, and so the police officers understand where the boundaries are.
Conrad, you're mute.
That's my bad. I wonder how much you might want to be like, oh, I agree with everything, or if there's ideas you might want to join with, or perhaps disagree with Miss Lucia, or just your thoughts.
I have to agree. I think the problem is that when it comes to Democrats, it's always an all or nothing deal anyways, collectively on a lot of legislature, not just with criminal justice reform, because I think they do the same thing they do as with collectively with firearm reform. They want to get rid of it all. They want to put further barriers. But criminal justice in terms of no knock warrants and eliminating the chokeholds and all that, they want to eliminate them all. And it, instead of actually doing some type of reform, reform is not completely elimination, because it's essentially criminal justice of elimination. It's supposed to be reforming something. You can't just reform something by completely removing it. You need to have some type of way of progressively moving forward. And I think that's where they're missing the ball. Is it's not really going to fix anything. We're seeing, they're doing this parole. They're starting to introduce parole back. And I think what we're going to start to see is starting an uptick in crime again. And it's going to essentially put the police officers' lives on a little bit more of a vulnerability. We all know there are bad eggs everywhere, but why would you collectively hold an entire majority accountable for a small minority? And that's the ultimate problem. And, with these no knock warrants, like he made Delegate Freitas stated, when there's a hostage situation, that person could ultimately die because of the fact that they have to knock. The hostage could not walk away. So in retrospect, what exactly do we want to put on the line in order to sacrifice? Does that make sense? It's like you have to give something to give.
And I would want to address this, on the other side of the aisle, in much the same way that viewer Miss Andrea Dixon wants to suggest that a possible solution, beyond just trying to hack at it with ideas like, okay, defund the police, which that's something I even ran on myself, but that's just a phrase to try to get the engagement. What do you do when you have the engagement and you're writing laws? One solution for a situation like this might be to help reduce police militarization. Also, what's the basis for all of this? The thing that's creating so much policing, the war on drugs. There is so much economic improvement that could happen individually for people if this was eliminated. Plus, a lot less of harsh policing could happen regardless of the community if we eliminate something like the war on drugs. So that's the idea that I would say present to you if I was in office myself. And I think that it could actually be bipartisan in that issue. So I don't want to be like, it's something that Delegate here would not agree with me on some issues.
Well, here's a question I always have to ask, because there's a lot of statements, like you said before, defunding the police. Some people really mean that. They mean completely defunding the police. Other people use it maybe as a method in order to engage in conversation or debate. But whenever I hear the militarization of police, I always ask someone, what do you mean by that? Because if you mean the militarization of the police, that you believe that there's a mentality that sometimes sets in where the police operate as if they're an occupying force instead of a community force. If that's what you're trying to stop, well, then I would definitely say, okay, yeah, show me some areas where you think this is taking place, and I'll be happy to work with you in order to try to make sure that doesn't happen, because that's clearly not what we want, and I don't think it's what the police want. A lot of people, when they say militarization of the police, though, they mean that, well, the police shouldn't use military style equipment, and that's where, again, I get into this nuance versus a really easy and catchy clickbait headline. So again, if you mean militarization is we don't want to create an us and them mentality between the police and the community they serve, I think that's perfectly legitimate. And I think there's a number of ways that we can address that. If you mean that the police shouldn't have access to certain equipment, well, then my question there is, okay, well, to what extent? Mm-hmm. And some people have said, well, it shouldn't be some of these larger armored vehicles or things like that. Okay, I think there's room for discussion there, even though you could make an argument with respect to like some EOD or bombing situations. But then on a lot of times, these military agreements between defense and law enforcement, a lot of it has to do with military surplus equipment that, I mean, it can be everything from body armor to helmets. And I'm not going to tell I'm not going to tell the spouse of a SWAT team member that they are not allowed to have the best equipment possible to protect themselves before they go into an incredibly volatile and dangerous situation, because it would make the rest of us feel better that it's not military equipment, right? That is not a fair trade-off. Absolutely. And so again, all I want is when we talk about this, can we define our terms? And then the best thing I think we could do if we really want genuine collaboration on this is to say, okay, here's the full spectrum of what we mean by criminal justice reform, or here's the full spectrum on what we mean by militarization, or here's the whatever it is, and lay out the individual policies. And then we can say, okay, these we just absolutely don't agree on, and we're probably not going to agree on anytime tomorrow. These we may be able to work on, but it's going to take some real tough work. And these ones we all agree on. Okay, great. Let's start with where we all agree. Can we at least get that done? But there's a huge political incentive to only focus on what we don't agree on, and not focus on what we actually do have some areas of agreement on. And you see that reflected in the way that legislation is carried. So for instance, I carried a bill for expungement of criminal records for anybody that was arrested for a crime where no victim was involved, right? So they broke a law, and it's a law because we say it's a law, not because they actually hurt someone in the process. They didn't hurt another person. They didn't take their property. They didn't steal from them. They didn't physically accost them, but they broke the law. Now they're in jail. When they get out, should we have a process for automatic expungement? Yes, I think they should. Well, the automatic expungement bill that we saw this year included violent crime. Well, I'm not going to agree to that. No. Right? So really, that goes back to the overall question is, can we focus on the areas where we have an agreement, and can we do that first? And then we can get to some of these other things. And I think if we do that, we can make some genuine progress.
Especially if future Delegate Conrad works with Delegate Freitas in the future, then we'll be able to do a situation like that.
Or Congresswoman Owen.
Oh, there we go. Exactly. You can start with the federal top down and be like, "Hey, here's."
Hey, I'm reaching for the stars. That's my thing. I don't want to be president. I don't want to be president. We've already had one president in my bloodline. That's enough.
Hold on. Do tell.
My maiden name's Grant.
Oh, wow.
I
am direct. I'm direct descendant.
I don't know why, but I was immediately remembered of the quote by Lincoln where he's like, "Give the rest of my generals what Grant was having when he was accused of being a drunk."
Yeah.
Oh no, he had a keg. He had a keg on the horse next to him.
Yeah. I love a great history like that. That is a cool piece of trivia. I'm glad I know that. As we're nearing closing out here, Delegate, I want to also touch on another viewer question. Again, from Andrea. In the next session, what policies would you like to champion? Do you have any policies that are in the works?
Education reform is so important to me. I can't emphasize it enough. So whether it's doing things like expanding career technical education, whether it's making it easier for kids to be able to get a tailored education to their individual needs, all of that's really important to me. And so I will continue to fight for this as long as the people of the 30th District keep sending me back. I would love to see a system where dollars follow students, because I want a marketplace of ideas when it comes to delivering education. I feel like our current public school model is based off of a 17th century Prussian model to make really good conscripts and factory workers. Right. And I don't want that. I want an individualized educational opportunity for our kids. And there's no reason why we can't have that as long as we're willing to open up to the marketplace of ideas. And I really think that starts with things like dollars following students. So I would love to see more of that. I've got some meetings going on where we're looking at how do we remove certain regulatory barriers that stand in the way of people getting access to internet. That's something that I want to focus on. I'm always going to be a huge advocate for the Second Amendment. And the other big one that's important to me has to do with things like occupational licensing reform. One of the things that just drives me nuts is, and I'll hear Republicans sometimes say that they're pro-business. I'm pro-free market, which means I want a marketplace where everybody can go and compete. I don't want a marketplace where businesses run to the government in order to get special privileges that is unique only to them or their industry. We kind of saw this with COVID, right? If you're a big box store, you're allowed to stay open. If you're the local mom and pop restaurant or the local mom and pop store, you're not. I hate stuff like that. So I want to see things like, I want to see things where we're not creating a cronyist economy. I want a free market economy, not a cronyist one. And with occupational licensing reform, I want to make it as easy for people to get into the sort of industry or business that they want to get into. And I am not in favor of all of these different licensure requirements that ultimately get set up not to protect public safety, but to protect those interests which already have a control on a certain aspect of the marketplace and are now using government to thwart their competition. Mm-hmm. So occupational licensing reform, education reform, Second Amendment, those are all issues that are near and dear to me and that I'll continue to work on and already preparing for the next session.
As we begin to close out for this evening, I want to give Beach Brother, Mr. Jose, his opportunity for a great business shout out today.
Well, tonight's business shout out, thank you for that intro, Conrad. Tonight's business shout out is going to be Cohiba's Cuban Restaurant. It's out in Chesapeake, 1298 South Battlefield Boulevard in Chesapeake. It's an awesome place to go and have some authentic Cuban food. Stop in and see the owner, Jay, and let him know that Jose and the Beach Brothers sent you.
All right, Mr. Jose, and any closing thoughts from your end tonight or any cool projects you are working on?
Currently, we're still with the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce of Coastal mm-hmm. Virginia. We're trying to reach out to small business owners and try to help them out as best we can, meeting with small business owners, see what we can do for them, what they need, what services they need, and, see if it's a perfect fit. And just trying to help everybody get to some kind of a norm so that we can, get over this and move forward our lives.
Indeed. Miss Lucia, again, I want to thank you for coming on tonight and being another Republican voice. We wanted to balance that out because last week was all Democrats. And any final thoughts you've had on tonight, what you like about the politics and perhaps stuff you might want to discuss regarding yourself and some projects?
I appreciate you guys for having me on. It's always been a pleasure to be on with you guys. Right now, I'm still taking kind of a leave of absence from the local political scene. As of last year when I was on the ballot and then had to take myself off due to personal reasons, car accident while I was pregnant, had the baby. So October, he's healthy. He's doubled in size, literally almost 18 pounds now at almost 5 months. He's a little chunker. He's huge. Just balancing out between being a working mom with 2 kids and one in the first grade and one is almost 5 months, and my husband who's, works for the Department of Defense and him handling his stuff with the COVID and making sure military facilities are taken care of. And then my job with my industry of marketing for a large construction company located out of here that's nationwide. Now it's just looking to get ready to get back on the political scene within the next year or two, and we'll see what the future has in store.
That means we're going to have to bring you on a lot more.
You never know.
There we go. And Delegate, you're about to go into another election season. I want you to give your closing pitch here. What you see yourself over the next year, and also touch on your podcast and anything you might want to highlight regarding either the Culpeper area or just cool things.
No, I appreciate it. I mean, I genuinely appreciate the opportunity. I mean, I know, Conrad, that again, you come from the political left, but you always give I think a fair hearing, and that's desperately needed. We need more opportunities to be able to share different perspectives. I think when we have a better understanding of where people are coming from, it makes it a lot easier to humanize the entire discussion instead of to some degree tribalizing it, where it's like they're bad, we're good. And that's been way too prevalent within political discourse. So I really appreciate the opportunity and just the way that you guys conduct and run the show. I'm running for re-election here in the 30th district, Culpeper, Orange, and Madison. We also do our podcast, Making the Argument, where we make arguments from the conservative perspective. And that's been a lot of fun. I like to do that. Ultimately, when it comes down, the whole reason I got into politics was really more about the philosophy of it. And the idea that it should be a battle of ideas, not cults of personality. And so I try to continue that whenever possible. But again, just really appreciate the opportunity. And we'll continue to do this as long as my family is willing to put up with it. So again, thanks again.
Well, I thank you guys all for coming on. We had a great show. We're going to close out tonight, and we hope you all have a great and fantastic weekend.
This show was brought to you by Positive Vibes Incorporated, our consulting services. We do credit fixes. We do tax resolution. We lend private money and debt consolidation. So if you need some of these services, we're waiting here for you. Credit fixes, tax resolutions, private money, and debt consolidation. Make sure you call Positive Vibes Incorporated.